Hi everyone, for this video we're going to talk more about CSS, and in particular we will talk about colors. We'll talk about text color, background color, border color. We'll also talk about how we could adjust the opacity of these colors. We'll also discuss about border styles, about the understanding on the CSS box model, so that we will better implement our padding and our margin discussions. Now, so let's start with colors. Now, in CSS, colors are specified using predefined color names such as tomato, gray, dodger blue, violet, orange, states blue, etc. Or you can use RGB, hex, HSL, RGBA, or HSLA values. So we talked about this very shortly in our discussion about HTML in the previous video, but we'll just discuss more about it and how it is done in CSS for this video. So for the text color, so all you have to do using CSS is to specify it under style. So for instance, you can say h3 style is equal to color and then colon, and then you need to specify the color that you want to use. So in this case, we're using tomato for the heading 3, and then we have the first paragraph using dodger blue, and we have the second paragraph using medium sea green. So it's basically specifying a color. Now, so later you will also get a refresher course on how you could substitute this with other options. Now for the background color, so this is for the text color. So just remember, all you have to do is to specify style is equal to color enclosed in double quote, and then you follow that with a colon, and then the color that you want to use, and then followed by the semicolon. Now for the background color, all you have to do is to use background. So instead of the color, you have to use background dash color, and then again using the same colors that are shown on your screen at the moment, you can set the background color of your text or your paragraph. So in this case here, you have a heading with a background color of medium green, medium sea green, and the second and then the paragraph here has a background color of orange. So you can use the colors, and to give you an idea of how it looks like, you can see it on your screen as well. Now let's move on to border color. So if you don't want to change the background color or the text color, you can also change the borders color. So all you have to do is to say style is equal to border. Okay, so border, and then you can specify the width of your border, followed by the kind of border. We will explain more about this later, and then the color that you want to use. So these three are actually specified under the border. So if you want to do away with the width or the type of line, then you can just specify the color. So as you can see here, for the first heading, which is dodger blue, okay, the second one is tomato, and the third color is gray. Now, so I mentioned earlier that aside from specifying the specific color, you could also use other options, and first is the RGB. So RGB stands for red, green, and blue combination. So as you know, you have numbers 0 to 255 for the red, also 0 to 255 for the green, and 0 to 255 for the blue. So I don't think there's any way for you to find out what will come out if you type any numbers from 0 to 255 for RGB. But if you want to display tomato, for instance, so other than using the word tomato, you can use the RGB value 255, 99, and 71. Now don't worry, I will give you the equivalent of the RGB or the hexadecimal numbers later. But for the tomato, to display tomato, you can Yes, as I mentioned earlier, you can use RGB 255, 99, and 71. At the same time, you could also use the hexadecimal value. And when you use the hexadecimal value, you always start with the hashtag or the number sign. FF6347, that's the same color as your tomato. Or you can use HSL, which is 9, and then 100% to make it solid, and 64%. So that's U. So that's U, saturation, and lightness. So U is 9, saturation is 100%, and lightness is 64%. Now later on we will also discuss RGBA and HSLA. So in this case here, as you can see, if you just simply put 0.5 here, then the opacity will be by 50%. We'll discuss more about this in a little while. So here is a slide which I actually retrieved from the previous video. So if you want to use a color name brown, for instance, the equivalent to that in hexadecimal is A52A2A. And that's the last column, is where you can find the color that will come out using that particular hexadecimal number. Now, so moving forward, so if your code, for instance, so you want to display the tomato color options, one option is you can use the RGB equivalent. So as you can see here, you have style is equal to background color colon RGB, and then you specify the color equivalent of tomato in RGB. Or you can use the equivalent hexadecimal value, or you can use HSL value, and that will still come out exactly the same as what you can see in your sample output here. Now, so if you want to display it at 50% transparency, then you can change the opacity value by 50% or 0.5, and that will display a lighter version of that particular color. But as you can see, it's still 255, 99, 71, just like the sample output here on the first. So it's still tomato at 50% transparency. So if you want to do that in the U saturation lightness version, then you have to use 9, 100%, 64%, and then the last is for the indication for your opacity, and you can specify 0.5 or 50%. Okay, so you can just decide if you want to use the code for the color, like the name tomato, or if you want to use the RGB or the hexadecimal value or the HSL value. Now, so for the background color, if instead of using background color light blue, no, you can also use either the hexadecimal value or the RGB value. So this is the same for the rest of the colors that you can specify in CSS. So for instance here, we are now indicating the opacity. So one way that you can control the opacity of a particular color is by explicitly defining it as opacity at 10%, for instance, or 30% or 60%, like in the case of the example here. So you have your background color is orange, and then you have div that first is 0.1 or 10%, div that second at 30%, or div that third at 0.6 or 60%. So here is the 10%. So you have here first, so that's using the 10% opacity, then 30%, 60%. And if you don't specify any class, then it will use the default color, which is simply orange. Now, so if you change this orange into green, if you change the word orange here to green, so this is going to be the equivalent when you display this on your screen. So you might want to pause this particular video later, or go back to this particular slide later, to try it out yourself. So this is exactly the same as in the previous slide, only that the background color is now changed to green. So this is your equivalent in green. Now the color values, if you want to use RGBA, is different. So here we're using opacity. Now if you're going to use RGB, you can use 0, 1 to 8, 0 to display the green color. Now if you want to specify the opacity, you can use RGBA. So just add the letter A on the RGB, and then you will have the fourth parameter, which is where you indicate the opacity of the color. So in this case, it's 10%, 30%, 60% in decimal form, and that will give you the opacity at 10, 30, and 60% respectively. So that's how easy it is, or that's how different it is to use RGB compared to the opacity here that we're using in the previous example. Okay, so just to show you the difference, now this one is using the opacity attribute. So this is a 10%, 30, 60%, and the default value, which is the color for the green. Now using RGBA, this is 10%, 30%, 60%, and the default. So it's basically the same, no, in terms of the result, only that you're using a different syntax, a different way of controlling the color opacity, at the same time specifying the color that you want to use for your website. And so that's your choice as a developer, a website developer, on whether you're going to use the opacity attribute or you want to use the RGBA code. So you might want to pause your video at this particular point and try the codes that I have shared in the previous screen. So moving on with our discussion, the next one is for CSS border style. So the border style property specifies the kind of border that you want to use for your website. So you can have from 1 to 4 values, and that is the top border, the right border, bottom, and the left border. So let's first show you what is the result if you're going to change the border style. So of course the default is the solid. So here you have dotted, you have dashed, solid, double, groove, ridge, inset, outset, none, hidden, and then you have the dotted, dashed, the solid, double. So what does it what does it imply, or what does it mean? How is it going to affect the result of your site? So if you're going to specify the border style will be dotted, it will use dotted for all sides, top, right, bottom, and left. Now this is dash, this is solid border, this is your double, groove, ridge, inset, outsets. As you can see, the inset is going to use only the top and left. It's going to be different from the right and the bottom one. The opposite of that one is the outset border. Of course, no border indicates that you don't want to have any border displayed or shown on all sides. Hidden border, and then you have your mixed border. So in the mixed border, you can specify any 4 of these. You have dotted, which if you're specified dotted as the first parameter, it will be applied on the upper border. So you have dotted here. Dashed is going to be applied on the right border. So as you can see here, you have a different right border, which is dashed. You have solid at the bottom, and you have double on the left side. So to use this in your code or in your site, so all you have to do is to specify a style. So this one is style/style at the bottom, and you just have to specify, say for example, if you want to apply this on your paragraph, then you can say p.dotted dash solid double, just to have a clear description on what will happen based on the border style that you apply into it or use in your code. and just call your paragraph and say class is equal to dotted, and that paragraph will be surrounded by the dotted border. So I want you to pause your video for a while and go back to the previous slides and try to apply it on your code. Okay, moving on to our discussion, I'd like to share with you the CSS box model. So try to understand that all HTML elements can be considered as boxes. So the CSS box model is essentially a box that wraps around every HTML element. So it consists of margins, which is the outermost part of your box. You have the border. So as you can see here, you have a green border. You have the padding right after that, and then you have the content. So of course, this is where you put your text. So if you want to separate or put a distance between your content and your border, then you have to add a value on your padding. If you remove or lessen the value of your padding, then your text will be very close to your border. So the content is the content of the box. So like this is not only for text but also for images. You have the padding, which is the area around the content. So usually, of course, we put a value on our padding so that there's a clear distinction between the content and the border that you apply on it. Now, of course, padding is transparent. And then the next one is your border, which is the one that goes around the padding and the content. And then you have the margin. And the margin is the area outside of your border, and again, this one is transparent. So with that understanding of the CSS box model, we can now easily understand that if you're going to specify, for instance, a width, border, padding, and margin, where does that go inside your output? So here you have a style, which is for your div here /div. So you're specifying that you want the background color to be light gray, and that explains why the background color is here light gray, and then the width is 350 pixels. Okay, now I will discuss more about the specification of your values later on, but this one is using pixels. You can use other units of measure, as what I will explain later. And then you have your border, which is 20 points, or rather pixels. And then you have your type of line, which is solid, and you have the color, which is red. So the width here, which is 350 pixels, refers to the width of your box. Okay, and you have the border, which is 20 pixels in thickness. The type is solid, the color is red. And then your padding is 40 pixels, which is the distance, as mentioned earlier, between your border and your content. And then you have the margin, which is outside your border, and that is 30 pixels. So now you have a deeper understanding of these attributes with border, padding, and margin. So kindly pause your video for a while and then kindly apply the code that I have shown you earlier. Maybe make revisions on the value. See how it will affect the box that you have created. Now this one is another example. So in this case, the padding is 80 pixels. The border is only 1 pixel in width, so that explains why the pixel is the size of your line is very small. The type is dotted, and the color is now using hexadecimal. So of course you can also use hexadecimal, as what I have mentioned earlier. So you might also try this one out and see how it affects your code as well. So kindly pause your video again and see how padding and the different way of specifying the border definition is going to look in your updated website. Okay, so thank you very much for trying that out. So again, just again an added discussion on the CSS model or box model that I have shared earlier. The CSS padding properties are used to generate space around the element's content inside of any defined borders. So you actually can specify a specific size for the top, right, bottom, and left padding. So the padding properties, I mentioned earlier that we were using pixels in the example, but you can also use points or pt, centimeter, etc. No, so you can also specify the percentage, no, which is the percentage of the width of the containing element, and you could also specify inherit. So of course, for these values, the negative values are not allowed. So let me show you an example of if you want varying padding for specific parts of your box. So in here, rather than just saying padding is equal padding colon 100 pixels, for instance, here we want to specify very specifically that the top padding will be 50, the right padding is 30, the bottom padding is 50, and the left padding is 80. And given this, if you're going to use div, the output is going to be like this. So the background color is light green, the border is orange, it's solid, and the width of that line is only 1 pixel. Okay, so that is one way of specifying your padding. Now, there's also what you call a shorthand way or shorter way of specifying padding in CSS, and that is by only writing it in one line. So remember that when you specify a padding, the order is top, right, bottom, and left. So given that, if you're going to say padding colon 25, 50, 75, and 100, 25 here refers to the top padding, 50 pixels refers to the right, 75 at the bottom, and 100 at the left. Now, so that given that this particular padding specification, the output will be like this. Now, another way that you could write it is by specifying variations of this. So rather than specifying 4 values, you could use only 3 or 2 values or even 1, as what was shown in the previous slide. But at this point, I want you to pause your video first, and I want you to try out the padding in that shorthand property. Okay, so moving on, we're going to discuss padding using only 3 values. So what happens if you only specify padding colon and then 3 values that will follow after it? Now, so if you use div, for instance, and then specifies padding 30, 40, and 80 respectively. So notice that there are only 3 values. What does it mean? That means that the top padding, okay, which is the first value that is indicated here, is going to be 30. The right and the left padding will be 40, the value in the middle. And the 80 here will now refer to the padding at the bottom of your box. So that's the difference if only 3 values are indicated in your padding attribute. Now, how about if there are only 2 values? If there are only 2 values, the first value here, so in this case we have 30 and 40, the first value will refer to the top and bottom specification. So that means your top and bottom paddings will have a value of 30 pixels, and 40 here will now refer to the left and the right padding. So that's what will happen if you're using only 2 values. And of course, if you only specify 1 value, that means all sites will use a padding of 30 pixels. So again, I want you to try out these 4 variations: 1 value, 2 values, 3 values, and of course the 4 values, and try to see the difference in the specification and how it affects your website. Now let's continue with margin. So you already understood that margin is the distance that is around the elements outside of the border that you have defined. So again, with CSS, you have also full control over the margin for all sides of your element, and that's top, right, bottom, and left, just like your padding. So very similar to our discussion of padding, you could specify here top is 80, bottom is 90, right is 140, left is 100. And if you're going to try that out, you will actually notice that there is a distance around your box that's going to follow that particular specification. So another way to do this is to use the shorthand property. So just like your padding, you can also just specify it in one line, and that will also coincide to that specification that we used earlier. So rather than specifying margin top, margin bottom, margin right, and margin left, you could also just specify margin colon, and 80 here will refer to the top margin, 140 will be to the right margin, 90 at the bottom margin, and 100 at the left margin. Now, so again, kindly pause your video for a while, and I want you to try out the codes that I have shared in the previous slide. So moving on, very similar to padding, I will just discuss with you how what is the meaning if you're only going to specify 3 values in your margin. So if there are 3 values only, it means that, for instance, here we have 30, 40, and 80, just like your padding. It means that your top margin will be 30, your right and your left margins will be the one that is specified in the middle of your declaration, which is 40, and then 80 will be used for the bottom margin. Now, for the shorthand property variations, if you're only going to use 2 values, that will refer the 30 here, the first value, whatever value you specify, and whatever units of measure. In this case here, we're using pixels, as what was mentioned earlier. You can use points or centimeters. In this case here, 30 will be the applicable margin for your top and bottom. The 40 here will be the applicable margin for your right and your left margin. Now, and then of course, if you only specify 1 value for your margin, that will be applied on all 4 sides. Okay, now you can also use auto. Now, when you specify auto, it means that you could horizontally center the element within its container. So automatically, it will be the job of your browser to control where the content will be placed. So the element will then take up the specified width, and the remaining space will be split equally between the left and the right margin, and that is the purpose of your auto, which is another value that you could indicate. So with that, I'd like you to pause your video again, and I want you to try the options that I have discussed under auto. And with that, I would also want to give you a short summary of what we have discussed for this video. We have discussed colors, and that includes specifying the colors for your text, the background, and your border, controlling the opacity, changing the border style from solid to the other options, and we even discussed about how you could use 4 varying borders for your text. We also discussed the CSS box model, and at the same time we discussed how you could control the padding and the margin for all sides. And with that, I'd like to say thank you so much for watching this video. Please do not hesitate to go back to the different parts of our discussion for this video. Try it out on your file and try to see how it will affect your website. Understand the difference between each of those variations, and yeah, that's it. No, good luck, and that's all we need to learn about CSS at this point.